Welcome to episode 64 of the Camerosity Podcast, the world's first and only open source film photography podcast. My name is Mike Eckman, and the guys and I are back for another exciting episode that is sure to keep your gas bill nice and warm. For the second episode in a row, we are giving love to a camera brand that we haven't devoted a lot of time to, Rollei, or depending on what era you're talking about, Franke and Heidecke. Before we get started, let's do some introductions. From Yellow Springs, Ohio, home of over 300 $29 cameras. Hey, Paul, are you going to have a fire sale or what?
I think I'm going to have a garage sale, a photo garage sale. As soon as the weather breaks, I just got to figure out, I got to get the invitations out because I've got baskets of cameras that need new homes.
Next, from Gainesville, Florida, the county seat of Alachua County. Hey, Anthony, are you looking forward to election season?
Let's get ready to Rollei.
We were waiting for that.
Finally, fresh back from cleaning his pool in warm and beautiful Sydney, Australia, is Mr. Theo Panagopoulos. Hey, Theo, did you remember to wear your sunscreen while you're out there in all that sun?
Oh yeah, sunscreen's become a constant now, and it's going to get rolled right on. Get rolled right on as soon as we finish here, and I'm jumping in the pool.
As I mentioned before, we're going to cover Rollei tonight. We have a lot of people who are excited to talk about this brand. It's very rich in history. And as always, we have a waiting room full of eager listeners, so let's let them in. All right, we got a perfect 12. Plenty of returning guests. I see Bill Smith. Welcome back, Bill.
Hey, how's it going, Mike? How are things in Indiana?
Oh, it's warming up here. All the snow is melting. It's constant humidity now.
We've got no snow on the ground in Toronto.
Jeez.
You're going to jinx it.
I see Tim Peters. Welcome back, Tim.
Yes, sir. Hello.
Right. Rafael's back, too. Welcome back, Rafael.
Thank you.
Refresh my memory. Where are you from?
Denver, Colorado.
Denver, Colorado. That's right. Patrick Casey. Patrick's back from
Portland, Oregon.
Portland, Oregon. Welcome back. Marc G's there, too. Marc, welcome.
Welcome. Thank you. From Phoenix.
Phoenix. Dean Robinson. I apologize if you've been on the show. I don't recognize you. Have you been on before?
Never have. This is my first time.
Have? First time caller. All right. Why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is Dean Robinson, and I am calling you from Covington, Louisiana, which is just north of New Orleans. And
Okay.
I've been a collector, photographer, enthusiast for about 10 years now, since the birth of my first grandson. That was
Awesome.
the initiator for me. So as I gather more cameras, I need more knowledge, and y'all have supplied plenty of it. Thank you. That's why I'm here.
Awesome.
I was just reading about the crawfish apocalypse in Louisiana this year. So no crawfish for Fat Tuesday this year, huh?
No, cannot be. I'm sure they'll come up with some somewhere. That cannot be allowed to happen.
John Roberts. Welcome, John.
Thank you for having me again.
All right. Yeah, you've been on the show before. Where are you from again?
Just outside of Vancouver, BC, Canada.
Vancouver. All right.
And I bet you, John, you're missing the Sydney weather now, having gone back.
It's actually not that bad here right now. We did get a little bit of snow there last week, but it's mostly gone already. I'm still wearing shorts though. So just like you saw me in your winter in shorts, I'm still wearing shorts here.
And we have a guy, I'm not sure if this is really your name, but if it is, pretty awesome. Johnny Appleseed.
No, it's not really my name.
What should we call you?
How about Steve Lederman? Or
Hey,
Stereo Steve. Stereo Steve is also fine.
Stereo Steve. Where are you calling from,
Yeah.
Stereo Steve?
Toronto, Ontario. I'm Bill's friend.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to admit it, but yeah.
Oh, come on, Steve. Yeah, we're all part of the Toronto Film Shooters Facebook group mafia.
Okay.
Yes.
So Steve's Zoom name is showing up as Johnny Appleseed, and there's a 100% chance I will keep referring to you as Johnny throughout the show. So
That's fine. That's fine.
well, welcome everybody. Obviously, most of you have been here before, but for Steve, Johnny, during the live recording, you're going to hear a lot of stuff that gets edited out. A lot of the hey, you're on mute, long pauses, things like that. We try to get rid of. So if there's anything that runs on and you want us to edit out, just let us know. But this episode is going to be dedicated to Rollei. I always get apprehensive when we jump into some of the German brands that have like such elaborate and confusing and long histories. but it's a lot of fun. There's so many great models to talk about. I guess, like I always do, I'll start off with a tiny bit of history. The thing that I think is really cool about the history of Rollei is that it's a company that really almost wouldn't have existed if it hadn't been for the oversight, not oversight, I should say, the lack of sight from another company, which is Voigtländer. So the story goes, well, first of all, Rollei originally was called Franke and Heidecke, and it was named after two men, Paul Franke and Reinhold Heidecke, both of which worked for Voigtländer around the turn of the 20th century. Paul was a sales guy. He was more into marketing, business side of it, and Reinhold Heidecke was he was the precision mechanic. He was the guy who did the work. He was a designer. He was the creative person for it. Around that time, Voigtländer was they were still more of a lens company. They were making some large plate cameras. They really weren't doing too much with miniature cameras because that just really wasn't the thing yet. At some point, and I don't want to get into the nuances of it, but Paul Franke would leave and go work for a company that made rifle scopes and other parts for like the military. That company went belly up. He ended up leaving there and going back to Voigtländer, which is the point at which he met Reinhold. They didn't know each other the first time around, but Paul, having served some time with the German military, had already started to see, the vest pocket cameras. Kodak had the vest pocket. There were a whole bunch of these small folding cameras that have, like a folding design that use 127 film. A lot of those cameras were nicknamed soldiers' cameras, because they could fit in a soldier's pocket. And many of the earliest battlefield pictures from World War I in like the trenches, a lot of pictures that you see that were taken by the soldiers were taken with either a Kodak vest pocket or at least something similar. And that's where it got its nickname from. But if you think about it, pretend you're in a war in a dirty, mud-covered, damp, wet trench. If it rains, you don't move. And you're using a folding camera with a leather bellows, and those cameras were tiny. If you needed to focus the camera, you kind of had to hold it close to your face. So if you wanted to stick your head out and take a picture of the battlefield, you literally had to stick your head out, kind of exposing yourself. So even though the vest pocket design was good for portability and capturing candid photos of the battlefields, it wasn't too good in the sense that the photographer was often an easy target. So Paul came back, and being the guy that had the military experience, he talked to Reinhold and said, "Hey, we should build something that would be a more effective soldier's camera. We wanted something that could be held further away from your body, so that maybe you could hold it above your head. That way you could kind of stick it up out of the trench, and maybe only your hands or fingers might stick out above the surface or something. And we wanted something that was solid, rigid, that didn't have leather bellows, that wasn't as likely to become rotted or damaged by moisture or something along those lines." So if you kind of try to picture in your head what I'm describing, a rigid camera that has a large viewfinder that you could hold above your head and shoot, you kind of have a TLR, right? That's not what they called it then, but this was his vision for the new type of soldier's camera. And I guess, the two guys thought, hey, that's a great idea. We should make that. But both working for Voigtländer, they approached the management there and said, we'd like to build this new type of camera. And they just weren't interested. For whatever reason, they felt like, we know what we're doing. We're going to focus on what we're already working with. And the two guys decided, hey, we feel strongly enough about this. We don't want to be held back by what you guys want to do. So they ended up leaving and they formed their own company. They didn't initially build what eventually would become the Rolleiflex, simply because they didn't have a lot of capital. They weren't established, opticians. Paul was, like I said, a sales guy, but Reinhold Heidecke was just like an engineer. So their first products were stereo cameras, very similar to what Voigtländer was making. They, tried to make a competing model to Voigtlander's popular stereo cameras, which worked out well. They called it, I have one right here, the Heidecke. The Heidecke, it's actually called a triple lens camera. It's a twin lens stereo camera. The middle lens is the viewfinder, and it has a waist level finder on top. The Heidecke use plate film. So you would shoot, I don't have it in front of me, but I think it's something like 42 by 110 millimeter plates or something like that. So this would shoot
45 by 107.
Okay, there you go. Perfect. I knew someone would know. But this is a very early Heidecke. They made them in 2 different sizes. This is the smaller one. Amazingly, this, you can't really see it, but this is serial number 777, which has got to count for something. Maybe it was a lucky camera or something. But this was the originator, the original Rollei camera before it was called Rollei. And then at some point, I think 25 maybe, when they decided to make a version of this that used roll film, it was called
1926.
There we go. Who's saying that?
This is Johnny Appleseed.
Oh, Johnny Appleseed. Well, since I hate hearing myself talk so much, tell us a little bit more what you know about these.
Okay, so the first camera was the Heidecke that you have there that took plate film.
Okay.
They also made a roll film back at some point, but they developed in 26. They developed the Rolleiscope, which I have here, that had a waist level finder, and this took 120 roll film, and the size of the pictures were 6 by about 6.5. So you got like 5 stereo pairs on a roll of 120 and 1 mono picture. And then the next year they created a 127 version, the baby Rolleiscope. And so that's I guess that's the counterpart, roll film counterpart to the smaller Heidecke, right?
So they just added ROLLEI as a prefix to mean this is the roll film version.
That's right. Yeah, and they had a great feature. The whole front of the camera,
it goes
has
up and
a
down.
rise. Yeah, yep. Has a rise, and I think the Heidecke does as well.
Yep, this one does as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're neat. I mean, you can definitely see if you hold one of these side by side to a first generation Rolleiflex. You can definitely see the family lineage. You know, it's very similar. The viewfinders are very similar too.
Well, the whole thing was that the tale, I guess. I don't know. Like, I don't know if it's true or not, but the legend is that they had one of these on its side, on a table, and that's sort of where they got. That's where they got the inspiration. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's just a.
I mean, you can kind of already see that it really actually is a TLR. It's a TLSR. Twin lens stereo reflex, if you think about it, because I mean, you still have the waist level finder, the hood, you still have the viewing lens. It's just instead of the taking lens being below it, you just have 2 stereo lenses on either side of it. So in a way, the Heidecke is a TLR. It's just not how we think of it. And if you go back to the story of Frank, you know, having this vision for an improved soldier's camera, the way he described it, a rigid bodied camera that could be held far away from your head. It always seems like I've run into this before, where when people kind of discover that any TLR, you don't always have to hold it at waist level. You can hold it above your head, and people are always like, "Oh, that's so cool!" You know, go to a concert. I don't know how many people are shooting concerts with Rolleiflexes anymore, but you know, any TLR, you can hold it over your head. And since it's a square image, it doesn't actually matter how you hold the camera. You know, you're going to get your image. But in a way, holding it over your head was actually the original vision for the camera. You know, like I said, as a way to kind of, you know, around a corner or above the edge of a trench or something along those lines. So finally, these cameras were selling well enough. They had enough money. What was it, 28? They came out with the prototypes for the Rolleiflex. 29 went into production, I think.
They might have been, it might have been 29 to 31. And then the version 2 came out in 32.
And they stopped making the Heidecke and the Rolleiscope around 1940. So they were sort of in production simultaneously.
You know, there's nothing more confusing to me than Rolleis, because they did some weird stuff when they were building them. Like this camera was made in 1932, and it's a serial number 2170000. Other serial numbers are 1003010, and it's still 1932. So they change models, and the serial numbers just jump all over the place, and nobody seems to be able to agree on what models are called. So it can get really complicated very quickly to try to figure out exactly what you've got.
Steve, if I can come back to your stereo camera for a second. Have you, I mean, I assume you've shot that.
I shoot them all the time.
Do you have?
They all work.
Well, did the 120? Did it have a special viewer? Because that's a non-standard size for your your basic
It gave me
stereo viewer.
sorry. It gave me more. It gives you more latitude when you're mounting the chips in a stereo slide frame. So you could play with the stereo window.
Okay, so they didn't come up with a bigger viewer. They just gave you the ability to basically reframe it.
Well, I mean, this is for modern applications. Like back then, I think a lot of this stuff was in print, like on stereo cards.
But did they?
The stereo opticons.
But they would have had to have made a bigger viewer though, because that's a bigger negative than your standard.
But I don't know if they would have had a viewer for them back then. I think it's too. I think that still would have been like in a an old fashioned stereoscope.
A cabinet viewer.
Oh yeah, or a cabinet.
Would have gone into a cabinet viewer or a handheld stereo opticon that you held up at a certain distance.
I've made stereo opticon cards for years,
sure.
And that's what I'm saying is that's a non-standard size. So I'm wondering if there is somewhere out there a pile of Rollei handheld stereo opticons that were designed for that camera to accommodate the bigger negative.
It could be, but Paul's correct in the stereo. There was a taxi fault from France. And I know a lot of there was a lot of rolleidoscope and Heidecke pictures that went into those.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, with I have this one that I got modified with a Rolleiflex prism, and this one actually has a different winding sequence, so I can get 6 stereo pairs out of a roll of 120 in 6x6 instead of 5 stereo pairs and 1 mono picture.
That's interesting.
So, yeah.
So, Steve, I have, my original Heidescope for the smaller plates. How would you recommend if I wanted to try and shoot this? Like, what would be my best option?
Well, either to get the 127 size plates, because that's basically what it is. I think that's the same as this baby Rolleidoscope. Yeah, either that, or if you can find them, there's sometimes third party 127 film backs. Roll film backs on eBay, and but you could probably get plates for it, right? You could get
but even if I could find them, my ability to get them developed and everything would be a bit prohibitive. So for now, this will be a shelf queen, but it does appear like it works.
Okay, so I'd say a third party roll film back then for 120.
Besides Steve or Johnny, the original Rolleiflex, does anybody know what type of film it took? The original first model?
117.
There you go. Yeah. And what's the difference between 117 and 120?
Not a tremendous amount, but the big difference is at the time of release, 120 did not have any numbers on the back of it except for the 2x3 numbers. 117 was numbered for the 2.25 by 2.25 shots. So it was necessary to get on the Rolleiflex because it's of course 6x6.
Yep. And it was shorter. I think they were only 8 exposures per roll instead of 12.
Does anyone know what that actual length was? I'm asking for a friend who's trying to run a 35 millimeter roll.
I don't, but I can tell you that a lot of back then, it was a very common modification. I think all you have to do is change the key, because 117 and 120 are the same thickness. It's like how 620 and 120 are the same thickness of film. You just had to change the flange so that you could fit a 120 in there. So I would imagine if you're trying to run 35 millimeter through an unmodified original Rolleiflex, you could very easily put the exact normal length of 120 through there. I would think.
I have an original period 120 roll here, the steel one, and my Rolleiflex original. The film chamber in here is actually not large enough.
Oh, it won't fit at all?
So correct. I have this one here. This particular example was modified for 620 because 620 has the slightly thinner spools. So this actually fits perfectly.
George Eastman's revenge right there.
Yeah, exactly. This is like a devil's Kodak right here.
Well, I just opened. So I have an original Rolleiflex from Kurt. I never opened it. I just opened it for the first time. And what spool is in there? A 620 spool.
Yeah, it was a very common thing. I read somewhere that most of these Rolleiflexes that were used past their original window were converted to 620.
then I was wrong. Then that would make more sense then, because this camera is tiny. Actually, if you hold an original Rolleiflex up to like any later Rolleiflex or any TLR, it's a lot more compact. I mean, these cameras grew in size. Yeah, he's holding one up there. I mean, you can clearly see when you put these things side by side. In fact, I have a baby Rollei, the original baby Rollei too, and although that is even smaller, that camera is tiny.
Mike, what's the serial number on that camera?
18316.
Yep. Because at 2, they switched over to 120.
So if the first digit's a 2?
Yeah.
Okay.
First digit's a 2, it went to 120. Below that,
I've got a quick question about those original stereo Heidecke. Why plates rather than cut film? Was there something preferable about plates? I mean,
I think they also offered sheet cut film holders as well.
Okay, so you could go either way.
Yeah, so it was up to you if you wanted
And
a glass.
I understand that conservatives thought that pros only use plates. This new film stuff is nonsense. Was it some?
It's just a fad.
I know a little bit of it is because glass is, of course, not flexible, and having such a long plate in the camera, such a long film in the camera, excuse me.
Oh yeah,
in the early days was kind of a questionable endeavor. So if you have this big piece of glass, that's always going to be perfectly registered at the film plane.
That makes sense.
I like that answer the best. We'll just say that's the reason. No, I mean, that makes perfect sense, honestly.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
I don't want to keep going down this rabbit hole because, I agree with Paul. It can be very confusing to really go into every little model, and I don't really want to do that. But so, Rolleiflexes were selling like crazy, and then sort of the sweet revenge to it is these two guys who used to work for Voigtländer created a decent copy stereo camera, ended up being more elaborate than what Voigtländer was selling. They ended up building their ideal soldier's camera, although I don't think is how it was ever used, at least not to any great degree. And then Voigtländer ended up having to play catch up. And then they came up with Anthony's favorite camera, the Superb, and I think 32. So while the Superb is truly a superb camera, and Voigtländer did a great job with their TLR, I have to wonder if there weren't a few behind closed door meetings at Voigtländer saying, dang it, why didn't we do this? I mean, had Voigtländer said, yeah, you could build your camera, would it have still been called the Rolleiflex? Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? But whatever, we could have been talking about a Voigtländer camera all these years, but instead they formed their own company.
I mean, if you look at the Voigtländer models, like the Superb and then the Icoflex a bit later, they are so over-engineered compared to a Rollei. I mean, they're beautiful cameras, scary to use in terms of the Icoflex, but you do something in the wrong sequence and you end up jamming the whole thing. It's interesting because they didn't take the opportunity to go with the original design Rolleiflex, and then what you said, Mike, is they played catch up and over-engineered it to a point where it was just a scary camera to use.
Was the over-engineering a result of we need to beat them and do something better, or would they have done that all? Would they have done that all along? Maybe if Paul and Reinhold would have stayed there and they allowed them to build their camera, maybe they would have overcomplicated it from the beginning, and maybe it would have never been successful at all. So, shoulda, woulda, coulda. You never really know how things are going to work out when you change something like that. So. It's plausible that maybe Voigtländer could have been the creator of the world's most famous TLR, or it's plausible that had they done it, we would have never heard about it. There's no way to know. But nevertheless, we do know about it. And Rolleiflexes, and then let's talk about the Rolleicords. Anyone want to summarize the primary differences between a Rolleiflex and a Rolleicord?
The winding, the crank.
If the Rolleiflexes were geared towards, I could say, the working professional and photojournalist, the Rolleicords were kind of like the prosumer models. So they sort of had, like, again, I'm talking early 1950s, you'd have the Zeiss Tessar lens, which then be replaced with the Schneider Zenar throughout the Rolleicord line from, I owned, the two I own are a 4 and a 5B, and they both have the same Schneider Zenar, but again, it's a simpler, like, instead of the crank, you've got to turn, a knob you've got to turn to advance the film, and it's a simpler camera. It's slightly lighter. still takes great, amazing photos.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
I've used it in traveling, and I've been to New York City twice with a Rolleicord. Whereas, Rolleiflex, I'd find, I'm not so sure, but a Rolleicord, it's like you don't have as near tears and regrets because of the cost.
For me, if you're talking about 50s and earlier, let's say the first 20 years of Rolleis, comparing a Rolleicord to a Rolleiflex in terms of usability, knob versus handle, not a huge deal. The very original Rolleiflex had a knob also, but from the old standard forward, they were all lever wind, whereas the cords always were knobs. Not a big deal. The cords had the lesser triplets, whereas the Rolleiflexes had the better lenses. Yeah, but the triplets still made nice images too. For me, though, the huge usability difference between the two is if the Rolleiflex has a dim viewfinder, the Rolleicords is nearly pitch black.
Absolutely.
It's
very
like
difficult
if you want to
see
replicate the feeling of having cataracts, look through my Rolleicord 4, and it's I only use that camera on a bright sunny day. My 5B came with some no-name aftermarket bright screen, which I love, and it's like it just makes them so much easier. But
no TLR from the 30s or 40s could really be described as bright, but there were varying degrees of dimness, and the Rolleicords were extraordinarily dim.
I have the Rick Olson screen installed on my Rolleicord 3.
Yeah, Rick's he was on, ironically, episode 1. He was in the first Cocaine and Waffles podcast, and he briefly talked about how he started making those bright screens. He actually contracted them from another company and started recreating them, but he does a terrific job with those. And he makes them, I think, for almost everything. You can get them for Mamiya RB 6x7s, any Rolleiflex. If it's not something that he has in stock, all you do is give him the dimensions and he can custom cut one for you. But yeah, the difference between an original screen versus one of him is like not only curing the cataracts, but also getting LASIK and maybe some kind of light amplifier too. It's definitely a huge difference. I mean, I think as the years went by the 50s, I think the gap narrowed. It wasn't quite as extreme of a difference, but I would argue that the original Rolleicords are almost unusable in anything but bright sunlight. And even then, you really only can see the middle of the image. You can't see the corners hardly at all.
Absolutely. I thought it was just that the mirror had oxidized, but no, it sounds like it was that way from the beginning.
Well, that does add to it. I mean, truly, you find an old TLR, I don't care who made it, there's a very good chance that the mirror is at least partially oxidized or desilvered. So replacing the mirror does help, but even with a mint mirror, it's still quite a bit dimmer. Was the first Rolleicord, were they all the ones that had the Art Deco pattern to it? Does anybody know?
The first one was the Art Deco pattern, and they also made that was the Rolleicord 1, and they made the version of it without the Art Deco as well, which was the 1A, and I have one here. So this one here is, this is the one that came after that, because the original one, you could tell they had a big lump on the side for the frame counter, and it was kind of this weird tacked on afterthought deal.
Yeah,
but remember, 120 didn't have the numbering back then for 6x6, so you still had the red window on the bottom that you had to line the first shot up with. But yeah, they came up with this one right afterward, and this is kind of the first version. This is the 1A, where they kind of took in all that feedback that people were saying about these weird design choices they made. Because remember, the Rolleicord was a brand new market sector, and this is the first version of that. Which I have to say that this is perfectly serviceable as far as contemporary Rolleiflexes go. It's still a great camera. It's just it's really, really dark.
So I was thinking, instead of just going through all the models, why don't we go around the room? Not quite a lightning round, but let's share, for each of you that have a Rollei of some kind, why don't you tell us a story of the first one you got? Maybe how you came across it, or maybe which one's your favorite to shoot. Does anybody have a...
Oh, I've got a story for you.
Go for it, Bill.
Okay, let's roll back the clock about 15 years ago. My brother loaned me his automat, and I've just been shooting 35 mil exclusively at the time, and I loaded some plus, I think it was plus X or it's FB4, I can't remember, one or the other. I got a decent roll out of it, but it was sort of like, I didn't have the means to scan it, and I sort of, yeah, okay, whatever. In the intervening 2 years after that, I got a new scanner. I went to Epson from Canon. My brother was moving, saying, "Hey, can you babysit all my camera gear?" Okay. So I had the automat again, and I had it for over 6 months. And I started shooting with it a lot. And then it's like, oh, damn, now I understand why. And I was just getting amazing result after amazing result. And it was the classic, yeah, I want one. So then my brother and my mom got together and got me a Rolleiflex. Depending on which site you go to, it's either a 3.5 planar C or a 3.5 planar E, depending whose expert's brain you're talking to on a given day. Doesn't matter, it's still a 75-35 planar lens, and it just plain delivered. And then I got into the whole Rolleicord thing. I was at a camera show in just north of Toronto in Thornhill, and I saw a Rolleicord 4 for $200, and it was pristine. Like, it basically sat in some guy's trunk for 40 years plus. So I called my brother and I asked him, "Hey, Rolleicord, any good?" He said, "Yeah, they're good." I said, "What's the price? What's he asking for?" $200 and change. "Yeah, buy it." Okay. So I bought the Rolleicord, bought some expired FP4, went to play with it, and it's like, yeah, love this camera. If, it is a little dim. So that was the slippery slope for the TLR side of the family.
I have a Rolleiflex from the 50s, and I've long heard it said that the 1950s, something about the German mechanical, the camera industry, everything else German mechanical, sort of, that was their golden era. And I love it because it has all the German attributes. It's smooth, and the optics, of course. I have a curiosity. I bought this at a camera store. This is a Cord 2A, and it's got a little plate on it from a camera store in Germany, Adolf Fischl in Berlin. And the camera store insisted that this camera it was obviously purchased in Germany, but that it actually went through a couple of air raids during World War II. Who knows if there's any, and I've run into that issue with the serial numbers that I can't exactly determine. If I understand correctly, this is a 2A. It was in production from 39 till 40 something. And so it's possible this camera, because apparently camera production continued during the war, which I find fascinating, because so many of the other optical companies had to make stuff for the military. And obviously, I'm sure Rollei was making stuff for the military, but I thought it was fascinating if indeed this camera was manufactured during World War II.
Lights continued to make Leicas during the war. I mean, as long as they were able to stay in production and the factories weren't bombed,
sure,
the military needed cameras too. So you're
That's
right.
true.
I mean,
well, that's what I was saying. I can understand completely that, I know the Luftwaffe used robots and all this and that, but be all that as it may, if this camera actually did go through an air raid, well, how interesting is that?
What's the serial number on it, Patrick?
Yes, 1041849.
That would be in 1947.
Oh, so it's post-war. Well,
Yeah.
End of my little story.
The 1A Type 3s ended with 1042 100.
Okay.
So you're at the very end of the 1As.
Okay, well, it's a nice story, and I'll stick with it in some company.
Yeah, I'm at Rollei Club now, and that's not to say there weren't periodic interruptions, but the K4B was credited as being manufactured consistently from 39 to 45.
Okay.
I'm sure there were, shortages at points, but I don't, unlike some of the lesser, I guess I shouldn't say lesser, there just were so many optical factories in Germany, especially in the Dresden area, that got transitioned over to war production. Sure. That they, a lot of those companies, the production like 41 stops and doesn't resume until later. But Rollei and Lights were two that I think continue to do what they had to do because there was value in what they were making.
Sure.
But I would agree with another thing you said too, is while there's certainly nothing wrong with the 30s or 40s Rolleis, I feel like the 50s is kind of where they really hit their stride. They're still classically made cameras, all mechanical. There's the reputation of the Germans that if something could be done in 6 parts, the Germans would use 12. These are incredibly complex machines, but it feels to me like the best of the best models are from the 50s. that's when that style of camera was still very popular. 35 millimeter, wasn't completely, in use by everybody. You look at old pictures of when Queen Elizabeth was inaugurated. I don't know what's the right term for that.
Coronation.
Coronation. Yeah, her coronation in 52, you can find tons of pictures of reporters, and almost all of them have a Rolleiflex or Rollei of some kind. You don't see too many Leicas. You'll see a few press cameras, but I'd say the dominant news camera was still a Rollei or some Rollei copy.
Charles Bronson was known to use the Rolleiflex in the Man with a Camera as well. Occasionally when he wasn't running around with his Graflex.
So anybody else have a interesting story about their first Rollei?
I have here, similar to the 2A, there's a 2B. It's a 1939 production one. I was able to figure it out. And I bought this one as my first, I'd say, semi-professional TLR. I had only had experience with like the really terrible Weltas before that, and like the Lubitels, which I wouldn't count those as proper TLRs if you ever used one. But anyway, I bought this, and I've worked as a press photographer for my college's newspaper for a number of years now. And I started bringing this to the hockey games. And I've taken some really nice, some prize-winning shots, and first-page news shots, I should say, with this camera over the years. I've since moved to a Nikon F. Well, that's fitting because most press photographers moved from Rolleis to Nikon Fs in the day. But that being said, the lovely 6x6 negatives you can get out of this is a Xenar lens. This has to be the sharpest of all my Rolleis for some reason. I don't know what it is about the Xenar in this, but it's 80 years old, 90 years old nearly, and it still works perfectly. And man, if you want a professional camera still, you can get these 1930s cords for just a song.
Well, there's a lot of triplets that are extraordinarily sharp. One thing that I think sometimes people forget, and not you, Tim, but other people, that just because a lens has less elements doesn't necessarily mean it can't be sharp. You add elements to add correction, near the edges, fix chromatic aberration, in the era of when most film was black and white, you only had to account for certain wavelengths, right? When you start shooting color through a prism, you're going to have the whole, Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon colors splitting up. And that's where you get a lot of the color aberrations, which require more elaborate lenses. But you get a good triplet, you might have a tiny bit of vignetting near the corners, but in terms of sharpness, I've seen some wonderfully sharp images I have an Ansco SpeedX. One of our very early episodes, we had a guy in the show that really wanted to get into 6x6, and he couldn't afford a Rollei. He couldn't afford most of the pro 6x6 cameras. And I said, go look for an Ansco SpeedX. And Paul's like, hey, I got one. So he ended up selling it to the guy. Wasn't that Michael something, Paul? Do you remember that guy?
Yeah.
I forget his last name. But Paul ended up, he sold him the Ansco SpeedX based off of our recommendation. And that has like a Wollensack triplet. And he came back a couple episodes later. Was like, oh my God, I couldn't believe how good the images were from this, incredibly basic camera. So for, people listening to the show, gas bites hard. I totally get that. And eventually we'll get to the Rollei 35s, and, most of them had TLRs, but you could get them, the high end ones with the sonars, a 6 element versus a 4 element. And I tell you what, man, if you can see the difference between an image shot on a Rollei 35 with a sonar versus one with a TLR, I sure as hell can. So less elements doesn't always mean not sharp, but that's my long diversion to what you said, Tim. Just because you have the Xenar.
If somebody doesn't believe that a triplet is just as capable as, a more modern lens, you can dispel that with 2 words: Argus Centaur.
Yeah, the Centaur is a great lens. The Soviet T43, I think it's called. That's a real simple triplet. Very sharp on the Sminas.
As a parallel to that, uncoated lenses. Yeah, there can be a flare problem, but if you don't have light shining into it, uncoated are to die for. And you might even argue that a triplet, there are fewer surfaces there, so maybe, I don't know, but
Yep.
Right, but I love using uncoated. Sometimes it's fun to have a light source in the frame just to see, but
you shoot an uncoated lens, especially on a 35 millimeter camera. I like to pair those up with the higher contrast black and white film stocks.
Sure.
Rollei RPX 25 is a near IR film. It's not IR, but you shoot the visible light spectrum and you're going to get some dark blacks. And I find that pairing uncoated lenses with higher contrast films somewhat equalizes it and gives it kind of a unique look that I really do like. But you're right, you got to be real careful. That's where a hood or paying attention to where your light source is, even the sky. If you're shooting an uncoated lens, even if the sun is at your back, if you have a bright sky, even that can kind of wash out your images. But in the right hands, in the right circumstances, they're going to make great images. I'll share my initial Rolleiflex story, but it's a repair story. My first Rolleiflex was an old standard, and I got it very early on at collecting when my budget was very small. So I think I picked this thing up for like $40. I thought, hell yeah, Rolleiflex for $40. But the focus mechanism was stiff as hell. I don't think the shutter fired. I mean, it was seized. And I'm like, well, I'd learned that it's still a Compur shutter in there, and I had limited success with cleaning Compur shutters. So I thought, I'll take apart a Rolleiflex and I should be able to get this thing going. And unbeknownst to me, if you think of most Rolleiflexes, they have the front moving standard. There's almost like a rack and pinion system, kind of. I don't know the proper term for it. But there's a set of gears that kind of move that thing back and forth. And I don't know if this is unique to the old standard, because once I took that camera apart, I have never touched a Rolleiflex ever since then. But I can tell you, if you do have an old standard and you're thinking of taking it apart, it's very weird. Behind the plate that the two lenses are mounted to are these 4 screws in each of the corners, brass screws. So one, top 2, bottom 2, and they all work together to move in and out, and they push. So when you focus to infinity, they all screw on one side, they screw clockwise, on the other side, they screw counterclockwise, so that they all move in the same motion to push the plate forward and back. And when you take it apart, you can individually rotate those, which is a horrible idea. They have to be perfectly in sync. And I tell you, it's a miracle I got that camera back together with the lack of experience that I had and no actual formal training. But I was very shocked at how complicated the original Rolleis were designed to be able to move that thing forward. But my thought was they probably were so concerned that if they were only pushing the standard on one side or the other, maybe it might be weaker. So they probably, I'm thinking the engineers thought by putting the points of contact near all 4 corners could ensure that the entire standard moved perfectly at the right speed. And it clearly worked. But once you take those things apart, getting everything synced and back in line so that you don't have one, a tooth off of the other 3 or something along those lines. So it was certainly a shock to me, and it definitely taught me to respect the people who do this for a living, because that was not an easy camera to get back together.
One more story?
Yeah.
10 years ago, I mentioned that my grandson was born, and rather than taking a digital camera to the hospital, I, on a whim, picked up a C3 that had been lying around for God knows how long, and said, well, I'll see how this works. Well, it turned out very well. I was surprised at how good the images were. And so I thought, okay, I think I would like to get another one and see how these old cameras perform. Well, the one I got was this. It was a Rolleiflex original, and it was the 614, which used 117 film, but I was able to modify 120 to go in it with a little bit of trouble, but I got it to work okay. The first images I got were spectacular. The camera was in excellent shape. It was spot on in terms of exposures, and I was completely amazed at how well this, at that time, 85-year-old camera performed. And so that started my Rollei binge right there. So
a mutual blogger that Theo and I speak to, Alyssa Torello, she's got her own website, Alley's Vintage Camera Alley, and she just recently posted a review of her original Rollei. And hers wasn't in the best operating shape, but she got some pretty nice images out of it, and she had to have hers respooled to 620 also. So if you get a chance to use them, just because they're old doesn't mean that they're not going to still make good pictures. Probably, I don't know if it's my favorite, because like I said, I don't have all the Rolleis. In my opinion, there's so subtle differences between all of them. I don't know that I know there's people who like to collect one of everything, but One of my favorite rollies to use, we've mentioned this on previous episodes too, was one of their discount cameras, the T.
Rollei Magic.
Well, that was a cool one. I do have one of those. Have no idea if you guys saw me standing up a little while ago. I know I have an Art Deco Rolleicord somewhere. I can't find it, but I do have the Rollei Magic 2. Oh, there it is. I see it. The Rollei Magic was the AE version, and there was a 1 and a 2. I can't remember which one it is. One of them you can still fire. You can control the exposure manually. The other one you cannot.
The 2 the 2 is manual as well.
Okay, so I have the 2 then. The 1 relies entirely on the meter, though. So if that meter dies, it's basically dead in the water. It was a that came out around the time when Rollei was, the market was starting to shift away from TLRs, and I think they were trying to come up with things to reignite sales. So they said, let's make an AE Rollei, but it was not received well. I think it was expensive, it was complicated, it was unreliable, and it didn't really accomplish what they had hoped because people didn't want it. If they wanted AE, by that point, I think AE was appealing to 35 millimeter, not necessarily roll film, but they only made the 2 models. But no, my favorite one is the T. And what I like about it so much, well, one, I think it's pretty because it's got the gray body, but it has that really cool location, the Jay Leno chin on the below the taking lens with the shutter release that kind of sticks out to the side. Ergonomically, it's really nice to use, and I kind of wonder why they didn't use that on more than one body, because you can hit the trigger with your left hand. You're supporting the camera from the bottom, and the trigger kind of sticks out to the side. The shutter release, I should say, sticks out about right where your left index finger would be. So it's a minor thing, but I really like these. I think they're real pretty, and they have. This one has the Tessar 3.5, so they didn't make these with the 2.8s, but still very nice.
Speaking of the Rollei Magic and their efforts to sort of adapt to changing times, does anyone know, did Rollei ever ponder doing interchangeable lenses? I know they made a wide angle and a telephoto Rollei, and I know but Mamiya was having lots of success with interchangeable lenses. Any clue if Rollei ever thought about it?
Don't think so.
Yeah.
I own a Mamiya C220F with most of the lenses. I love that kit. But I don't think Rollei ever went down that garden path.
I think they were too happy with the Rolleinar kits.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Right.
Yeah.
If you can find them.
Well, Voigtländer had a prototype. There was going to be a Superb 2 that at least 1 or 2 prototypes were made. I think that had interchangeable lenses. Obviously, we know about the Mamiyas. There was a very uncommon French TLR called the Reflex that had interchangeable lenses. It really wasn't even interchangeable lenses. You literally unscrewed the entire front plate off the camera and just swapped it out with a different one. But I have the Rollei Wide, which is just a wide angle lens and viewfinder permanently mounted to the camera, or you could just get the regular Rolleiflex and just add through the bayonet, the bay filter I meant, change the focal length through it. I love the lens cap on this thing. It's so big.
That's the other thing that drove me crazy about Rolleis. The filter sizes were so inconsistent and poorly marked. You had bay 1s, bay 2s, and bay 3s. And in theory, it should have been easy to figure it out, but they weren't always marked. So you really had to get a caliper to figure out exactly what size they were before you started buying filters.
Or trial and error.
Yeah. Here's a weird one. This is a Rollei Cotter.
Okay.
It's a Japanese made copy of the Rollei from 1938.
It's got the same typeface.
Same typeface.
Yeah.
They didn't put an I in it. It's just ROLLEKONTER. This is model 2, which these things are very rare. But it's a dead copy. Even the top of it, the plate looks a little bit like the Rollei.
Any clue who made the optics for that camera, the Japanese camera?
Yeah,
it was 30s.
1938. This one says it's a Hitnar, so I'm sure they were Japanese, but who knows who they really used.
Yeah. There were a lot of, I don't know what you call it, gray market people just making stuff for other people. It could have been Konica. I mean, that could have been a Kanishi Roku product. It could have been Asahi. It could have been just some company you've never heard of before. There was a lot of that, it was kind of the Wild West. Germany and Japan, I don't know that they really cared too much to respect each other's patents. Although that's not true, because Canon, when they designed the original Hansa Canon, they stayed away from the Leica thread mount, because lights had a patent on it. So I guess I guess it just depends on which company we're talking about. Some of them were more respectful of patents than others. Clearly, the Rollei Contour company. Does it say who made that? What the name of the company was?
That was actually, I believe, the company was Rollei Contour.
Okay. Probably.
I think that
Rollei
was
Contour, Kogaku, Kogyo, Koki, something. Yeah. I'm working on a review right now of a camera called the Fujita 66, which is more commonly known as the Calamar reflex, or Soligor 66. And Fujita has nothing to do with Fuji. It's a completely separate company. And I've been trying to dig down the rabbit hole to learn more about the origins of that company, and it's very difficult. So we have a lot of good information about the big Japanese companies, but the lesser known ones, there's almost nothing out there. Even Sugiyama's Guide to Japanese Cameras usually has very little about some of these early Japanese companies.
So Mike, my journey to the Rolleiflex TLR runs through Czechoslovakia. I had never shot a TLR in my life, and was just looking for like a starter TLR. And working through the eBay store of our friend Kupog, I came up with a very nice Flexorette 6, which is sort of a beautiful Art Deco, has most of the features of a Rolleiflex. And, I enjoyed it. It's it's one of those ones where you have to like look at the manual every time you go to load it.
It's a little different. Yep.
Because it's not entirely intuitive. At the time I enjoyed shooting it, but I had 3 different iterations of the Kodak Medalist and Medalist 2. I had like an early prototype. I had the black lens 1 and then a 2. I thought, I don't need 3 Medalists. So I sold that, and through our friend Mike Novak, ended up with a Honeywell branded 3.5F. And it was a little dodgy. The slow speeds didn't work. Just had, it was a little stiff. So I sent it off to our friend Alan at CameraWorks and got it back. And it's even though I've got that, and I've got a Yashica 124G, and I've got the Flexorette, it's hard not to just go back to the Rollei whenever I want to shoot a TLR. It really is the standard that I have to measure them by. Just the ease of use, the intuitiveness of it, the layout, the smoothness. Yeah, so I'm really happy with my 3.5F, even though it's not the fastest. It's not the highest spec version. I would never know that. I've never been disappointed by shooting a roll through it.
That's why I love the Yashica D so much, for many of the same reasons you described. For one, it was one of my first. I think it was the second TLR I ever shot, and the first that was in good shape. And it's got a triplet. No, actually, that's not true. Mine has the Yashinon, so mine did have the 4-element lens. But most of them have a triplet, and they're really good too, and it's smooth. That's the thing about. I'd say probably my number one vice about Rolleiflexes, and it's not even a fault of the Rolleiflex. It's that, like anything, these cameras do need regular service. We are, as I am, very spoiled at how frequently I can get a camera that hasn't been touched in 50 years, and it still technically works. Like, it still makes images. Granted, it's not as smooth, it's not as accurate. I wouldn't take it out on a once-in-a-lifetime trip cross country and take pictures I can't recreate with it. But there's a lot of cameras that can be used without service, but that doesn't mean you're getting the full experience of them. And unfortunately, with the Rolleiflexes, is they're such precise instruments, because it's really what it is. It's an instrument. You take these things apart, and there's just gears everywhere. It's amazing what they were able to fit inside those bodies, but they need proper lubrication. They need cleaning. They need a CLA, every couple of years. Like, Paul, what would be a typical for a pro photographer? How often would they get their camera service? Once a year?
Yeah, once a year for especially a wedding guy who can't shoot.
So you need to service these things, and if you don't, the Rolleiflexes are their own worst enemy, and that sometimes they're very tight. Unless you have a huge, we always talk about a gas budget, but even worse is a CLA budget. They talk about buying a Harley after you buy the Harley, you're going to spend more money accessorizing it. With vintage cameras, if you really want to use these things, you could go broke CLAing some of these things depending on how rare it is. But you get a properly CLA'd and lubricated and perfectly working Rolleiflex, and I have no doubt that they're gems. But sometimes your simpler models are actually better to use because there's less to gum up, there's less to be stiff. The automatic frame counters are the number one most likely thing to break on some of these cameras. And I think that, and if you're just trying to shoot one for the first time, you're going to have better luck getting a simpler one than the more feature rich ones.
Paul, this may be a question for you. Like I said, my 3.5F is Honeywell branded. And I know that, Honeywell was responsible for distributing Pentax Spotmatics, and they were responsible for distributing Canons. Like I've got my Canon dial that's co-branded as a Honeywell. Do you know how often or how long Honeywell was involved with Rollei? Because mine's the only one I've ever seen that actually has the Honeywell logo on the top of it.
Yeah, I have a Magic 2 also that has that.
I think it was 1978 or 79 is when they stopped. And the way I'm dating that is the Honeywell imported an enlarger called a Honeywell Nikkor 67, which was made by LPL in Japan. But when they stopped doing it, Rollei started distributing it, and it was called the Rollei Nikkor 67. So I think it was like 79, and Rollei after that, I think, went to HP Marketing as a distributor.
And was Ponder and Best involved? Do I remember that correctly?
Not with Rollei.
Oh, all right. Okay.
Yeah, not with Rollei.
I honestly, until now, had no idea Honeywell and Rollei were linked. But I Googled
Honeywell distributed Rollei very early on. There was a company called Burley Brooks out of Chicago was the original distributor.
So you see the Rollei logo on the hood says Rollei Honeywell.
Yes.
Is that what yours looks like, Anthony?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, Burley Brooks was distributing about into the 60s.
I didn't know that.
And then Rollei of America from 76 to 78. So after they went from Honeywell, they went to Rollei of America.
That's interesting. You'd think I would have thought that they would have been big enough by then that they could have done their own distribution, but maybe not.
Well, they didn't have much. They didn't have enough to sell.
That's true.
They didn't have enough products, to keep a sales force going was the problem. I think Rollei came in 73. So that would have been, the Honeywell would have been about a year before that. So it'd been like 72. So I was wrong about 78 or 79.
We've spent more than half the show talking about the TLRs, which makes sense because that's really what people think. Even today, despite all the changes with Rollei, when you say Rolleiflex to people, I think a majority of people come up with the TLRs. But clearly, they had a lot of other interesting cameras too in the years since then. But the 50s, by the end of the 50s, their company, their success had slowed. Their profits were slowed. Professional and advanced amateur photographers were switching to 35 millimeter, either rangefinders or SLRs. And they didn't have anything else. I mean, this is a company, they're a one-trick pony. They made TLRs and that's it. So in the early 60s, they had to go through some corporate restructuring. Early 60s, they hired a guy named Heinrich Piesel. And Heinrich Piesel was, I guess he was a physicist or some kind of designer. I don't know exactly what his background was, but his job was to find ways to make the company more profitable, investigate new products. He had an idea of creating a 6x6 SLR, use their knowledge of making TLRs and make an SLR. He expanded their product line to include slide projectors. And then eventually, he was responsible for bringing in the Rollei 35, which we have spent a lot of time on. It's the famous, how many dented corners do you have? But my favorite story about the Rollei 35 is that Rollei didn't design it at all. And in fact, it was designed by Heinz Vosk, who worked for Virgen. So you think Virgen, Dixa, this guy worked for them. He came up with this great idea for a compact miniature 35 millimeter camera. And interestingly, similar to the Voigtländer story I shared earlier, where these guys had this idea of making this great camera and the parent company didn't think it would be a good idea. So they ended up building it themselves. Similarly, Heinz Vosk had made a tiny little camera and they didn't want it. So, he kind of bounced around a little bit between companies before finally winding up at which they were called, I think they were called Rolleiwork by this point. They shifted away from the Franke and Heidecke name. But anyway, 66 comes out the Rollei 35, which, we've spent a lot of time talking on this show. Wonderful little compact cameras, very, very strange. Collapsible lens. You can't even, once the lens is out, you cannot recollapse the lens, like push it back in the body until after cocking the shutter. There's a whole bunch of strange oddities of that camera, but once you get to use it, they're really, really nice. And like I said earlier, even the 4-element SLR versions are fantastic. I know, Paul, you're not a fan of scale focus cameras. Paul walked away. They don't have rangefinders, and that's not to jump around too here. This supposed new mint Rollei that's been previewed and everybody's chomping at the bit to see what it is. They're designing that camera off the Rollei 35, but the Rollei 35 was a great camera, very popular. They continue to produce it in strange gold plated special editions, I think up until like the year 2000, if I remember correctly. So if you count the special editions as part of the lineage, the Rollei 35 was in production for quite a while. They eventually moved on to SLRs, the SL35. I reviewed one of those a while back. That's the era 71, 72, I think, when it just became clear that continuing to make German quality cameras in Germany was just cost prohibitive. So they had invested in a plant in Singapore. So from about that era, if you had a Rollei camera made after that, most of them were made in Singapore, right? I see Bill's got one there. Paul's holding one up.
This is actually, Mike, an Appleseed.
An Appleseed? What's that?
Appleseed. Appleseed was a French department store called Fresh, and they bought the bodies. This body is a Voigtländer VSL1 Rollei, but it's made in Germany.
Okay.
What's odd about it is it's a thread mount lens. The lens is made in Singapore by Rollei, but it's a screw mount.
And this is going to spin my head. I've researched this, and even I don't understand it. You had this trifecta of Rollei, Zeiss, and Voigtländer, who, like, from about 64, if I'm going to get this right, Zeiss bought Voigtländer. The Icarex, the Zeiss Icon Icarex, was originally a Voigtländer Bessamatic or Bessaflex. I think it was called the Bessaflex. So Voigtländer was trying to make a new SLR. They hadn't released it yet. Zeiss Icon purchased them, took what they had made, tweaked it, released it as the Icarex. The Icarex could be had in either its own bayonet mount or the M42, which you talked about, Paul.
Right.
Then in 72, Zeiss Icon got out of the camera making business altogether, sold, if I remember correctly, Rollei, or I don't know. I like I said, I don't want to go down this. It is absolutely insane how many times Rollei changed hands.
They sold Voigtländer to Rollei.
To Rollei, yeah. Well, there was a German like camera store that owned it for like a year. It was, you talk about brand engineering. Yeah, it bounced around, but yeah, at one point, Rollei was sold. Rollei was owned by Samsung at one point. I mean, it's bounced around so many times. So, Paul, for you to have a French department store, German-made Voigtländer bodied camera with a screw mount lens, yeah, I believe it. It was nuts. I mean, it's almost depressing. You think of Zeiss Icon, Voigtländer, and Rollei as these premium German marks, and they were just like struggling to stay on. I mean, the economy, the Japanese photo industry was in full swing. The Germans I think they held on to that old way of thinking, the over engineering. We've talked about before how a large number of West German SLRs relied on leaf shutters far too long, instead of the focal plane shutters. There just was a lot of old way of thinking that worked fine 10, 20 years after the war. But by the late 60s, early 70s, it was, you needed to modernize, and most of the German companies just couldn't do it.
Well, Rollei in the U.S., the problem they had was their distribution was really bad. They had Rollei of America, who tried to distribute themselves for a while, and that didn't work very well. They went to a company called HP Marketing, who was a good company, but they didn't have any products. I mean, they had Rodenstock and a few other Gepi slide mounts and Mecha Blitz flash units, just odd stuff that really didn't have any major distribution in either the U.S. or Canada. So that really affected the sales of the products. And then they tried to come out with all these special editions, and especially in the TLRs. But the only success they had at that period of time was actually the SL66, which is Anthony's favorite medium format SLR.
It is. It's really, I helped evaluate one for Paul, who had picked it up from a seller here in Gainesville. And I'm a person who has never enjoyed shooting Hasselblad. Spent several months with a 500 CM and it never gelled. I just ruined so many rolls of film through that camera. Just never got into the workflow of it. The SL66 is one of the few cameras that when I showed images to my wife Janet, she just looked at it and said, "Those stand out above and beyond what you've been shooting on the other cameras." I found it to be a very charmed camera, and of course it has bellows up front and movements, and you can do macro with it, and all the lenses can be flipped around backwards to make every lens for that camera system had bayonet mounts on both sides of the lens, so you could flip them around and make any lens into a macro lens. It's a really cool system.
The opposite, the other side of that coin, at the same period of time, was the SL26. A lot of people aren't familiar with this camera, but Rollei and Codiflex both made 126 SLR cameras with interchangeable lenses. And my feeling is that the SL26 is it uses Zeiss lenses. They made actually 3 lenses for the camera.
Yeah.
They made a 28 millimeter 3.2, an 80 millimeter f4, and the standard lens was a Tessar 40 millimeter 2.8. And the thing about it is it's such a precision camera.
Well, it's a precision camera that was made for cheap film.
Yeah, that's the problem. That's the problem with 126.
Yeah,
there was no pressure plate, so it relied on the cassette itself to hold the film flat. And it did an okay job, but it only kept it flat as long as the camera itself would hold the film under tension.
Right.
And the cheaper cameras did not hold it under tension.
Yeah, I remember reading a little bit. They put effort into adding additional springs, I think, in the gearing that would actually advance the film, that it would somehow allow it to maintain flatness a little bit better. So, you get even a fraction of a millimeter off, and that's the difference between a razor sharp image and just an okay sharp image. So no matter how good of a lens you have, and what's infuriating is you could shoot 10 rolls of 126 on that camera, and 5 of them could be great. It varied by cassette. There could be nothing wrong with your camera, and the results you would get from one I shouldn't even say roll, it's a cartridge. One cartridge from the next would vary. You just never knew what quality of images you would get from a camera like that. And, you just wonder, why do they even bother in the first place? Like, who was the target market for that? But, they made them long enough. Someone had to have been buying it, I would imagine.
So does that make the 110s even worse?
The 110 was worse because the film was smaller. I mean, that was a disaster. I mean,
I have a cursed history with the 110. I've had a friend that acquired a Rollei collection, and he had 6 new in the box, and I went out to field test them, and every single one of them had a broken film advance, and it would load the first image, but then every time you go to advance the film, you had to pop the back open and re-latch it before it would advance film. It's got like a broken cog or a drive in it somehow. And then Paul sent me one from his recent haul, and it has the same exact issue. So I've had 7 new in the box 110 Rolleis. Not one of them has been able to shoot a roll of film.
Anthony, are they A110s or E110s?
Both.
Both. Okay. All right. Because I've had the same thing. I've got 3 or 4 more of them in the basement right now that don't work either.
Yeah, they'll load up the first image, but then they won't advance the film. And I've looked at every trick possible, sort of. I'm assuming it's a plastic gear that's just died over time. It's not engaging. It doesn't advance the film. If I can, not to be a complete contrarian, the Rolleiflex SL35s, I joke that, when I shoot that camera and I post about it online, it is probably the most hated camera that I post about. I mean, if I post that I'm shooting my SL35, people just come out of the woodwork to tell me what a crap camera they are, how retailers hated them because so many of them had warranty repair issues, that they're just broken out of the box. It was a Singapore made camera. It's aperture priority. But I got to tell you, my take on it is the bad ones have all sort of sorted themselves out, right? If they're going to break, they're broken and they're gone. If you find one now that works, it's a really charming camera. It's probably my favorite straight aperture priority camera. I'll take it over an Enemy Super. I'll take it over, a Nikon with the aperture priority. The camera, the ergonomics are great. It's got a great feel to it. It doesn't matter that it's made in Singapore. And mostly, I didn't even realize the bewildering array of lenses that were made for that camera. But like I said, my friend Miguel, they ended up with this Rollei collection from a collector in the Midwest. He must have 30 lenses for it. They go from, extreme telephoto to 12 millimeter fisheye. And I've heard, their decal mount, DKL mount, different than the other decal mount. Was it a Voigtländer? There was another one that just doesn't quite fit. I may be wrong about that.
No, that's right. You're right, Anthony. It was Voigtländer.
But the lenses, they're fantastic. I've heard that some of the lenses were made by Zeiss. I heard that some may have been made by Mamiya.
No, that's true. Zeiss had so 72 Zeiss got out of making cameras, but they continued making lenses. So they continued to offer lenses. I hope we have time to talk about it, but even the Cosina Bessas, the Voigtländer Bessas, there was a Rollei version called the Rollei 35 RF, which I have a review of this coming up soon too. But this camera was made in 2002, and the difference between, it's essentially the exact same thing as the Cosina made Voigtländer Bessa R2. But the one difference was the kit lens was a 40 millimeter f2.8 sonar. And that was the exact same formula of lens that was available on the original Rollei 35. So they were essentially making a new rangefinder in the 21st century that still had a lens formula from that era, and they got Zeiss to make it. So there was a long history of Zeiss continuing to make these lenses in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even in the 2000s. So I would be willing to bet, Anthony, that is definitely a Zeiss lens.
Weren't the Rollei lenses for the 35 millimeter SLRs, weren't they the QBM mount?
Correct. Quick bayonet mount.
You're right. I stand corrected. It's the drugs.
Paul, did you say that you had the Voigtländer VSL1 and it was made in Germany? Is that what you said?
That Ifbaflex was the same camera as the VSL1. It is made in Germany.
Okay, so don't take me forward for it because I'm not always right, but my research says only about 500 of those were made in Germany before production shifted.
They're very rare, rare cameras.
So you knew that then. All right.
Yeah.
So to circle back on what I said before earlier, so early 60s, Voigtländer was coming up with something called the Bessaflex, a new SLR. They got bought up by Zeiss Icon. Zeiss Icon rebranded the redesigned the Bessaflex to be the Zeiss Icarex. The Icarex came in two different mounts, screw mount and their own bayonet mount. 71, Zeiss Icon created an updated version of the Icarex called the SL706. Very next year, Zeiss Icon got out of making cameras, sold Voigtländer to Rollei, and then Rollei re-released the Voigtländer VSL1, which was just a rebadge Zeiss Icon SL706, which was a modernized Icarex, which itself was based off of a Voigtländer design. And then Paul has the French version of it. And that just happened in like a 2-year period. And when you get into the SLs, the SL35 is what Anthony was talking about. I have an SL35ME, which is a little bit later version with the electronic shutter, but it still has the planar lens. Most of them by that point had switched back to a screw mount. This one doesn't, though. This is still a bayonet, but they had a lot of them in screw mount. They had some of them in bayonet mounts. It was a disaster. I think at that point, they were just kind of going off of brand recognition. There might have been some people who just really wanted to own a German camera, even though it wasn't made in Germany at that point. these cameras just they don't have a good reputation. Anthony gets hate mail when he shoots his, but I think that there was just a lot of ill will towards the brand at that time. And it makes sense why it's true. I mean, for one, the German photo industry was struggling, but when you have a company that's constantly changing hands every few years and there's new owners coming and going, quality control is going to suffer because, you know, cost cutting is always in. But yeah, so I mean, Rollei's introduction into 35 millimeter with the Rollei 35, great camera. I recommend that to anyone who's interested in like a nice little gem-like precision camera. They aren't cheap, but the one advantage the Rollei 35 has is they are actually quite popular. They're very plentiful. You don't have a problem finding good condition versions on eBay. And because they're easy to find, I think it tends to keep their prices a little bit low. You know, they're certainly not cheap, but they're not as, I mean, you can get a Rollei 35 for much cheaper than a Leica even.
And they went through multiple iterations before they phased out as well. There's the 35 LED. There's, you know, they've got sort of cost saving versions that came out towards the end. And you know, they're all fine cameras. You know, even the cheaper versions are great little cameras.
So are we talking the ones that are the TE and the SE?
So the SE, the S is a sonar, T would be Tessar.
Yeah, but you have the E affixed, they changed the meters, so it's like,
oh, that's right. Yeah.
And they changed, of course, the battery, which I heard is also an adventure to, you know, find a workaround for. Yeah, I was just going to suggest, everyone knows the Tessar and the Sonar Rollei 35s. They made for 1 year one with the Schneider Zenar 40-35.
You have one of those, Anthony, don't you?
I do.
Yeah,
I do too. I love it.
Yeah, it's great. It's great lens.
And they had to do that because of shortages. Zeiss couldn't make the lenses fast enough.
Yeah, we're thankful that Schneider stepped in.
Yeah. And you can get the Zenars and the Rolleiflexes too, like the TLRs. And one of mine has it and it's just as good.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's maybe some, you know, you wish you had the Zeiss lens, but you are not losing anything by having the Schneider versions. Now, is it true? Does anybody know the Sonar Rollei 35s were only made in Singapore?
Only made in Singapore.
Right. So you cannot get a German built Rollei 35 with the Sonar.
No, they made the Sonars in the 70s. They moved production in 71.
Yeah, only the first version of the Rollei 35. They just called the Rollei 35. Only that was made in Germany. And then in 71, you're right, they switched production to Singapore. And since the Sonar version came out in, I believe, 74, that means that it would be made in Singapore.
I would question anybody that would die in a ditch about whether the German ones are better than the Singaporean ones, though. Because I've got one of the plain old 35 with a Tessar with a Rollei Tessar on it, if anything. And it produces, great results. It's actually one of my most popular articles on photo thinking. But it's interesting that assumption is that the quality control was not as good in Singapore. I would question that because I imagine that Rollei would have made sure through management that quality did continue. So it's interesting how we do have that constant discussion on whether Singapore or German made keeps coming up.
It's similar to the debate about the Nikon E series lenses. There was just this belief that the Series E Nikkor lenses were automatically worse. These are junk, cheap plastic lenses. But history has proven that those lenses have held up very well. Optically, they're excellent. I just think that back then, there was a little bit of snobbery, maybe. Oh, well, I don't want a plastic Nikkor. It's going to suck. I think there were some people that took that same approach, Theo, of, oh, well, if it's not German, then it's going to be junk. And then that became people's belief, and it just became pervasive, and it's extended on to the 21st century that just people assume that because it's not from Germany, it must automatically be bad. And we now have half a century worth of evidence that suggests that I'm sure there's a margin of error, but it's small. I have a couple of the Rollei 35 from Singapore too. I have one German one, and the rest of mine are all Singapore. And I can't tell a difference.
Same. I have the original Rollei 35 from Germany, and I have another one from Singapore. Both the same model, both the same lens. I can't tell a lick of difference between them.
Right. And anymore, whether it's been serviced or not is going to make more of a difference than any microscopic tolerance difference maybe between the two factories. Singapore that's been CLA'd is going to be way better than even the best not CLA German model.
Yeah. And I mean, to me, the more pertinent argument is, and it goes a little bit back to what you were saying earlier, Mike, is to be honest, the sharpness between the lenses, the Tessa and the Sonar, is probably not that significant. It's the rendering that's the difference, and it depends which look you prefer as well. So yeah, I'm with you on that. I'm saying, I don't believe that the sharpness, especially when you're talking about film, you could tell the difference by looking at it. You may, because of the rendering of the colors or the rendering of some of the background, maybe of how it produces that.
I like lenses that are imperfect. To me, that's the reason to shoot old lenses, old cameras, is if I wanted a sterile, sharp, technically perfect image, I have plenty of digital cameras that can give that to me. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a good reason to shoot a Rolleiflex. Get some awesome looking, sharp as can be, croppable 6x6 images. But then sometimes it's fun to get the ones where there's rendering and vignetting and some strangeness to it that's a little bit unpredictable. That's fun too. That's Marc Faulkner, he's not here, but he just picked up his first Leica M3 and he was comparing it to his Canon 7. And there are people who would say those two cameras shouldn't be compared. They're just not the same league. And I said to Marc, Marc, if you do a head-to-head comparison between a Leica M3 and a Canon 7, the winner is you, because you have both. And that's, I think, what's great about, if you want a Rollei to shoot those beautiful looking 6x6s that are sharp corner to corner, you can do that. But then get the Argus TLR or the Lomo or Lubitels, that have imperfect lenses that give you a distinct look that, in my opinion, I think is going to turn more people that don't know a lot about film and these are the same people that are using Instagram filters and Snapchat filters and everything. You show them an image from a Lomo, I get why people love those cameras. It's because they like that they're different, and different isn't bad. I don't want all my images look that way, but that's why we have, multiples of some of these.
When you mentioned the croppable, I've often thought it's fascinating how the TLRs hit an interesting sweet spot. There's enough resolution and you have a slightly wide angle lens. So if you're going to use just one lens, do it like that. It's slightly wide angle. You got a lot of resolution so that if you need to crop something, and the film is big enough so that you can crop 35 millimeter, you have trouble doing that. But I think that's one of the reasons that the TLRs had such a long run.
Sure. Well, because think about it, with a 35 millimeter camera, we talk about this with half frame all the time. Portrait and landscape, you got to keep changing the orientation of the camera, right? With a TLR, though, if you want to take a portrait of someone, you just crop it later. You take your square image and you just chop off the sides, So if you want to do a landscape, the resolution on those is good enough. You could largen. I mean, has anybody enlarged a 6x6? Like, how big can you go? You could go pretty big, right?
Yeah, you can go very big.
But I remember, 16 by 20. I mean, there was always there was a quantum leap from 35 millimeter to medium format. Medium format to 4x5, not so much. But something about medium format 4x5 is better, but it wasn't as great a leap as the 35 millimeter to medium format. So
if you're making a bulletin board, or a billboard on the side of a highway from a film print, then you want a big print. But if you're trying to do a 16 by 24, you guys can't see it, but I have a 16 by 24 canvas print right on the wall above where the laptop I'm recording on is. And it's from a 35 millimeter camera. And I'm sitting 2 feet away from it and it looks sharp to me, and that was a 35 millimeter camera.
I have to agree with that because, interesting enough, I've got my, everybody gets their wedding pictures done when they get married, and I got married in the days of film, and the photographer fronted up with an RB67, and the pictures were fantastic. I mean, they're great, but he also had a 35 millimeter with it. The picture that we actually liked the most to put up in the house is actually one from the 35 millimeter, which needed to be cropped a little bit to fit nicely where we wanted it to as well. And that's probably a 16 by 20 or maybe even a touch larger. And it's fine. It looks fantastic.
So, back to the croppable thing with a 6x6, give yourself enough space, give a little bit of room. If you want to switch back and forth between a portrait versus a landscape. Like, let's say you have no intention of printing these square. You want 3:2 aspect ratio, and you're going to crop everything. You can go back and forth between landscape and portrait. You don't have to do anything. You just keep holding the camera the same way and crop it later. So getting that extra resolution and the larger negative allows you to do that. And if you hold it upside down over your head or around a corner, and, for people who are big into street photography, there's something about standing on a street, taking pictures of people with a camera to your eye that draws attention to you. But the second you hold something to your waist, you disappear. And I think that's, we've done a whole Rollei episode and haven't once mentioned Vivian Maier. I think everybody knows the story of Vivian Maier, but you look at just the amazing candid photos she took. And I bet you 90% of the people in those images had no idea they were being photographed, but if Vivian Maier was walking around with a Leica, you betcha those images would not have looked as good, and that has nothing to do with the Leica, but it has to do with your interaction with your subject holding a waist level camera at your chest versus to your eye, because people associate, even now, I think it's funny. I've gone places with a film camera and what are you doing? I don't want to be, like even now I've actually had people come, I've never gotten in a fight or anything over it, but I think we've all had those close calls on occasion where we're photographing someone.
Yeah.
But I mean, and it's always because you're holding a camera. And usually I can dispel it by just saying, hey, I collect old cameras. I usually show them what I'm looking at and they go, oh, okay. They usually let it go. But I've heard some stories where people won't even let it go. Yet everybody walks around with smartphones all day long. Within a millisecond of me taking a picture, I could have this on Facebook all over the world. Yet my film camera, it's going to take me a week or more, sometimes way longer than that before anybody will ever see it. Yet that belief that this is a camera, even though you can't immediately post it online, and the ultimate resolution, there's no AI, in any
I
of this
got a
stuff.
story. I was shooting with a Rolleicord. I was in Toronto's Leslieville, which is sort of hipster neighborhood, but kind of like former working class. It's sort of layers. And I was shooting this the Duke Hotel from across the street. They got a TTC stop, and it was like bang. So got the shot. I was turning around, sort of walking west, and then this baby mama, her mother-in-law, and a 12-year-old boy were stalking me for 6 blocks. And you're taking photos. I'm like, you do realize the second you leave your apartment, you're on a 4K security camera. There are security cameras on all the streetcars in Toronto. There are security cameras on the buses, subways, corner stores, everything. Hell, shit, your smartphones. But, and it's just at a point, I just sacrificed a roll of Ilford HP5. I just dropped it to the ground. I didn't even want to give it to them. I just dropped it to the ground, turned around, walked. And it's like, it was just, the weird thing is, Rollei 35s, they're just so damn small. I can just immediately get the shot, put it in my pocket, and it's like, if someone does check, what camera?
It's also because it's zone focus. It's zone focus. That's why, because you can just bring it up and take and put down again. You're not focusing while you're actually looking through the viewfinder.
No, but it's like, and again, this was pre-pandemic. Throw the global pandemic into the mix, and people's, it can get a little more special in this day and age. And
if it would be tempting if someone objected to say, all right, give them the roll of film just to see what they would do with it. Half the people are probably, oh, I don't see any pictures on this. But what would the average person today do with a roll of film? They don't know.
The fact the 12-year-old boy was embarrassed at the behavior of his mom and grandma, that's even more hilarious. The kid is like, Mom, stop, please, just stop already.
But let me ask anybody here, we've had a couple people leave, but have you ever had a negative interaction with somebody while using a TLR? It's always when you're holding a camera to your face, right? I went to see a band back in November at just a small club in Chicago, and walking in, they had a list of things you're not allowed to bring. And it was a modern sign, like it said no vaping. So this wasn't like a sign from 30 years ago. And it still said no professional photography. And it had a picture, it was a drawing, but it was clearly like a film SLR, so that, like on a computer, the save icon is almost always still a floppy disk, right? On your cell phone, the phone button is almost always a handheld phone cradle. You know, we've
Yeah.
kind of, our society, even people my kids' age who've never seen the original stuff, they know that that symbol is a phone symbol, yet they've never ever held a cradle phone, right? They've never even seen a 3.5-inch floppy. My kids have seen film cameras, but most kids have not.
It's called a visual anachronism.
A bit visual anachronism.
I have to ask the question though, because now, yes, everybody relates taking a picture with holding it to your face. But back when the Rolleiflexes were popular and the Rolleicords and all those Japanese clones and so on, it would have been normal to have people taking pictures looking down at their cameras. I wonder if the perception back then, people just didn't care as much because,
I think they didn't care.
Yeah.
People are way more entitled.
There wasn't any social media or anything like that. And people were actually taking a bit of an honor to having their picture taken.
Yeah.
So I suspect there's a bit of that as well. But definitely to your point, Mike, these days, no one would look twice at you looking down at the camera except to say, oh, wow, that's interesting.
I think it's biological though, because it's for the same reason as you could be in a room of people with sunglasses on, like blackout sunglasses, and you don't really see them as much as if they didn't have glasses on at all. So like as just being human, you see somebody looking at you, like directly through a camera, for example, you see them looking at you, where since you're looking 90 degrees to the person through a waist level finder, it's less confrontation.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Well, except if you're on a plane and you're changing film on a plane, and then some lady reports you and says that then you get face down on the tarmac.
That was he had a Rollei, wasn't it?
Yeah,
it was a
Rolleiflex.
Did that guy ever come out and like give his side of the story? Because I remember when it happened, the dude went into like hiding, and then I never heard anything more about it. Like I'm curious to know like what the outcome of that was.
I was sort of wondering if you're a member of any of our communities.
I don't know.
Well, let's put the call out there. If you're listening, dude, if you're listening, call in. Please call in.
Well, it's funny you bring that up because I thought of that. I flew back and forth to Los Angeles twice last summer, and I was hauling a boatload of cameras. I'm like, I am not pulling any of these things out.
Right, yeah.
I really wanted to play with them. I'm like, nope, I'm not becoming a security threat.
Right.
As difficult as it is for me mentally to do that, every single flight I've been on the past, I'd say 3 years, I'm pulling out, I don't know, an Olympus pen, a Nikon S2, even the Nikon F, which has a noticeable clack. And I've gotten some great aerial photos. And yeah, you do get some weird looks. But I mean, in this day and age, people are realizing, he's probably some hipster or something with some old vintage thing.
Real quick, back to Vivian Maier. Has everybody seen Finding Vivian Maier, the documentary? I assume most people have, and her photos are great. The story of how the photos are found is great. It's just a fascinating story. And being from Chicago, seeing some of those pictures is just extra eye candy for me to see that city from way back when. But was I the only person watching that movie? Just as the movie went on, it's like she was a little creepy.
I think she had some anger issues. I think it was sort of suggested by the kids that she took care of. Yeah. There's also a great British documentary on her too. I think Who Took Nanny's Pictures or something like that. It's also worth finding.
I'll check that out because it's a cool story. I mean, I'm happy we have these images. I just was watching the movie and there was always an underlying God, this lady's supposed to be a legend, but I don't know if I would like her if I knew her in real life.
So, yeah. I mean, she didn't get a lot of her film developed. So
no.
Was it purely the act of, to use your word, being creepy? That's actually what she was enjoying rather than actually taking the pictures. And she was using the camera just as an excuse.
Anyone seen Vivian Maier's work on the wall? Been to an exhibit?
No.
I was fortunate to see 2 exhibits. One at Stephen Bulger Gallery in Toronto, which was sort of a private gallery. He had a curated set of images from one collection. And then there was another one that went through the Art Gallery in Hamilton, which is another city just about a 35-minute drive west of me. And it had a great series of images, both her TLR work, which was black and white, but also her color slide work, which was shot, I think, through a Leica 3F.
Right. Yeah, she did use Leicas too. It wasn't all Rolleis.
So yeah, it was interesting to see it. It's one thing to see it in a documentary and see it online or even a book. It's interesting to see it on a gallery wall. It's just like, oh wow.
And she clearly had talent too, because I mean, I've seen many of her images of like herself in like a bathroom mirror where she would like point the camera and then she'd look at the reflection, of herself. And I mean, just her understanding of geometry and lines was really, really good. And she had an incredible eye. And that's honestly something that I need to work on. I've spent so much of the past 9 years working on reviews, and I unfortunately don't get to spend that much time with any one camera where I really get to get used to it. You always hear, I want to get Johnny Martyr on this show. I've met him in person, great guy. He's just a little podcast shy, but he shoots weddings with his M3 or M6. I think he has an M3. He has a 3F or a Model A that was converted, 1930 Leica A that was converted with a rangefinder. I mean, he shoots
FM2 as well, I think.
Yeah, but
he's a big FM2 fan.
But I mean, this guy shoots professional weddings still today, available light with a screw mount Leica, and his results are fantastic. And the reason I bring him up is that's the definition of the camera is an extension of him. He's so familiar with them. They're like second nature. He loads in a film he knows and a camera he trusts, and he can get some great images. And I would like to one day, with at least a couple of these, get to that point, where I can maybe one day be 1/10 the photographer Vivian Maier was or Johnny is. But that's in the future for me.
If you shoot a Mamiya 7, you'll get there.
That's true. You're right. The best camera ever. I'm going to get there with an Argus C3. I'll get there.
Yes. Now, I want to know if I'm in the wrong profession, though, because Vivian Maier's, buying Rolleiflexes and Leicas and so on a nanny's salary. Is there something I should know about what nannies get paid?
I think she lived like very modest.
She was very frugal.
Yes,
She was very frugal. She lived in the family. So
yes,
I think the shelter costs were, not on the table. So in the end, she could probably
Why not?
Use 3F or a used Rolleiflex.
Well, and let's be honest, the expenses in the film, because I mean, people bitch and moan about the rising prices of film, but when you adjust for inflation, prices today are actually still cheaper than they were at certain points in the past. And she was shooting, I mean, she did a lot of black and white, but when she started getting into color film, I mean, inflation adjusted prices, she was paying $10-15 again, inflation adjusted per roll, and she had hundreds of them. So on a nanny salary, yes, she bought that camera, but she had to keep buying film, and there was just so much of what she shot. So it brought her joy. It was the part of her identity, and that was that. But if you're listening to the show and you haven't seen, if you don't know who I'm talking about right now, go Google Wikipedia Vivian Maier, check out the Finding Vivian Maier documentary. There's so much already out there about her. Her work is fantastic. The story is just cool. If you like stories of found film and how this lady was discovered, sadly it happened, she was already gone. In a way, I think that's the best way to it, because I get the impression if she was alive, she probably wouldn't talk to anybody. So we're getting close to the end here. Hopefully anybody listening isn't upset that we didn't cover every single little variation of Rolleis, but that would be impossible to do in a show. But like I said earlier, my favorite part of the story is how these guys wanted to build this camera working for Voigtländer. They said no, they left. They ended up finding their own company, becoming one of the most successful camera brands in the world. They made the Rollei 35, which was designed by a guy who used to work for Virgin, who they didn't want it. They got bought out a bazillion times. I mentioned they were owned by Samsung. I briefly mentioned the Cosina Rollei 35 rangefinder. I will definitely have a review for that camera out in February. It's a really terrific camera. I know they weren't common. Most of what I can say about them applies to the Cosina made Voigtländer Besses as well. The best part of those cameras is the viewfinder. They are fantastic. Plus it uses Leica M mount, so you can put any Leica lens on there that you want. Great cameras to shoot. Get a CLA Rolleiflex. If you have a Rolleicord, maybe upgrade the viewing screen, but otherwise there's no FOMO. Was that fear of missing out between those?
Mike, is is that Rollei RF plastic like some of the other Voigtländer Cosina?
The earlier Voigtländers were like a lot plastic. This has, I'm sure there's plastic in here because it's not that heavy, but the entire body is like thin aluminum. So the body itself is definitely aluminum. And one big difference that they did to the Rollei 35 RF versus the Besses is they put a much thicker rubber grip on the front and back. And I've never owned a Bessa R2, but I've held them, and the grip on this is fantastic. It's not sticky at all. I mean, I'm pushing my thumb into it, and there's absolutely no stickiness like you see on some of the Cosinas. But this has a wonderful grip. It looks great. And although I don't have a Leica M mount 40 millimeter lens, I don't have the lens that this originally came with. I was able to get it body only. But it, since it uses a Leica M mount, I was able to just find some other Leica lenses to shoot with it. But if I had one complaint, and this applies to all the Cosinas, is, let's see if you can hear it. It's very loud. You compare this to like an M6 or any Leica, it's probably not really coming through the microphone, but it's a clunky shutter.
Yeah. It sounds like an SLR.
Yeah, it's based on the Nikon FM10.
Yeah. So it's not a quiet camera compared to the true Leicas, but beyond that, it's a wonderful, and I love the viewfinder. That to me, that's an Achilles heel. The difference between me liking and loving a camera usually has to go through the viewfinder. I'll have to wait and see what this mint Rollei is. Was it Theo? Did you find the website where you could get a Rollei logo printed on like any consumer product that you wanted? I think I saw that in one of the chats.
It wasn't me, but I have seen it somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, unfortunately, with a lot of these legendary names, they get bought out so many times, you're essentially just buying the name. I mean, there's no lineage to anything anymore that dates back to those original companies. I do find it interesting, though, that if you do go to Rollei's official website, whoever owns it today, they do, company history dates back to 1920. So it's like the Montreal Expos are now the Washington Nationals baseball team, yet the Washington Nationals have Montreal's history, even though it's a different city, different team name, I guess. I guess if you buy the rights to a company, you get to claim all their previous accolades too. So
maybe in the future, what we can look at is where the new Mint camera that they're building at the moment with the Rollei branding, we'll look back at that as history as another chapter in the Rollei lineage, actually.
You never know. Maybe it'll be the camera that reignites something. I don't know what.
No, I'm definitely excited about it.
I'm excited. I mean, I don't ever want anybody to think, there's all these rumors of a new Pentax, but it's a combination. It's exciting because I want new stuff. I absolutely do. I'm not unhappy about that, but I feel like there's been so many disappointing announcements, Kickstarters that didn't pan out, or products that do get released and they're nowhere near as cool as they originally thought, or they just don't show up at all. Or if they do show up and they're so expensive, and I get it, it's a low volume. Like you can't make a profit on something, that's cheap, but, produced at a high volume. I mean, Leica's still selling M6s for thousands and thousands of dollars. So there's clearly a market there. I think it's great. I encourage them. If someone handed me one and said, "Hey, Mike, you want to try this?" I'm of course going to say yes. But, my excitement only can go so high. Especially when I have enough stuff to play with that's still working. Does anybody have any last minute questions or real quick stories of recent pickups that they want to mention?
I'll make one remark.
Go ahead,
if anybody's looking to get you want a Rolleicord or a Rolleiflex, but for some reason you don't want to get a Rollei, you can go with their number one competitor of the era, Zeiss Ikon, pick up an EcoFlex. These have all the build quality and lens quality of the Rolleis. I'm holding here an EcoFlex 3 from 1938. And yeah, this thing is even denser than the Rollei with equal lens quality. And yeah, you can get these for much, 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 much less money than a Rollei because it doesn't have the name.
Go to Rick Olison's website and he'll tell you everything that can possibly go wrong with that camera.
Oh yeah, there's a lot that can go wrong. They likely
wrong.
will need servicing, but they're pretty reliable once you get them serviced.
Should and do everything in the right sequence. Otherwise, they just jam up.
I'm gonna reach out to him. I haven't spoken to him about 2 years, but he was on the very first episode of the show. He granted me an interview before I was even doing podcasts. He's an awesome dude. He's in Kentucky, so he's just south of you, Paul.
Yeah.
And he's an interesting guy. Between making the bright screens and all the work he's done repairing cameras, I'd like to talk to him again, pick his brain about some other stuff too. Anybody else?
That was now you're into the ulterior motive. So I am shooting this for my Frugal Film project, and I'm shooting it with bulk loaded film. That's why I wanted to know the length, because it is a 620 camera, or it shot the one. What was it, Tim? 117, right?
All the EcoFlexes were actually meant for B2 film, which is the European equivalent of 120.
Okay, so then it would be the same length as a 120 roll.
Yeah, that's just, you can fit standard American 120 in there, and it should work fine.
Okay, so that's why I was trying to figure out the length, because this is geared so that it only does 12 exposures, and then after that it's freewheeling.
That you have one of the just post-war, I believe, EcoFlex 1s, and it has, you can see the same counter as my EcoFlex 3 here. And all you have to do is put your film in, put it up to the top with the take-up spool. You open up the little red window on the bottom, roll until you see the number 1, close that, and then with your thumb, use that wheel on the side to reset the counter to the number 1 setting, and then you should be fine.
Yeah. So it works great. It's just the end of the roll that was the issue.
I would think if aside from the exposure counter, if you were shooting a camera that just let you keep going, you could probably shoot a longer roll of 35 because you don't have the backing paper.
No, it somehow has some sort of interlock with the
it's the interlocks. Okay. All right, guys. Thanks everybody for coming on the show. We did lose a couple people. Anthony had to go. A couple other guys dropped off. For our next show, episode 65, we are finally going to do another European-friendly time zone episode so that our friends in Europe and other areas of the world who can't normally join us during our typical recording time should be able to join us. So like we've done with previous Euro time zone episodes, we're going to open up the doors at roughly 7 o'clock London time, 8 p.m. Central European time, which is noon for the Central Time Zone in the United States, and 1 p.m. Eastern Time Zone. So while you don't have to be in Europe to join us, we ask that anybody who's wanted to join and just couldn't due to our normal recording times, take the opportunity to come talk to us and share us your stories and your guests. We'll be doing that on Monday, February 12th. But no, stay tuned as always. The topics and discussions on the Camerosity Podcast are influenced by you guys. We want to hear from as many people as possible. I love seeing return guests. I love having new people. Sometimes the new people show up. Tim, your first episode was great. Johnny Appleseed, you were fantastic. You definitely helped me out with the Heidecke section there. So that's always nice to have someone that can take some of the talking away from me. All right, you guys have a great night.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thanks everyone. Bye. We're dying in the heat, mate, here. It's already 37 degrees Celsius today. But yeah, I'm jumping straight in the pool after this. Just to let you guys know, I'm getting a few warnings about my unstable internet connection. I think it's because the heat has got to the equipment outside. So
good Lord.
It's melting his modem.
you look like you. Is it warm in the room where you are?
It's a bit warmer. It is.
You've got a glow.
The air conditioning's,
Yeah, you've got a glow about you. You have a Summicron white. You have a wide open Summicron glow.
The air conditioning is struggling to keep it below 24, 25 degrees in here at the moment, Celsius.
Wow.
And that's
I thought he had a radioactive Takamar who's yellowing his picture a little bit.